The way that Mark has imagined his involvement with Nice appears different than the way Dimble images Mark's relationship to Nice for him. As he confronts Mark with truth, he shows him that you are, at least in some degree, the accomplice of the worst men in the world. He does not allow Mark to continue acting and playing the game the way that Nice does, in which words do not mean what they say. Dimble confronts him instead and says, I'm offering you a way back into the human family. As we've seen, Nice moves him away from what it means to be human, or what we saw with Weston and Paralandra. It unmans a person to let this kind of ideology dominate and enslave you. And instead, Dimble is offering him a way out of that. And he puts it in the supernatural imagination. It's a narrative between not being in the inner ring or being outside of it, but being either damned or saved. While he doesn't know which side will actually win, he's telling him which is the right side. And this idea of right or wrong, of course, is something that Nice has been moving away from. Even when Hardcastle said there are two alternatives, she didn't say which side will win. She said which one would be more fun. And as a sadist, we know which side she thought was more fun. The next move for Mark, conversion-wise, takes place when he's in prison. He's been arrested for the murder of Hengest. Of course, he had nothing to do with that. They've framed him so that they can control him. And once he realizes in prison that they have framed him in order to control him, he no longer sees them as the enviable inner ring, but instead as his enemies. They have been playing upon his hopes and fears. He has been like a puppet. He has been reduced. He has become a servant, and he is disposable. They are able to kill him at whim. This revelation for his imagination makes him see himself the way Dimble did, that he is a fool. And he recognizes that his foolishness does not begin recently, but it goes all the way back. He begins to go backwards to his conversation to Wither. Why didn't he recognize how ignorant Wither sounded when they talked, that he wasn't able to say anything directly? Back to Lord Feverstone and his desire to be in Feverstone's company. Back to his desire to be in Curry's sect. And then he goes all the way back to high school and even when he was a young kid and he turned on the close friend he had in order to be in the inner ring. I think by unpacking this, Lewis shows something true about all of our weaknesses, that the moment we actually commit these great sins does not come out of oblivion, but it has been a gradual descent, a gradual reduction of our nature that has allowed these kinds of sins to take place and opened the door to them. And this is what we get to see Mark moving away from. Once he has unpacked all the way back, this opens him up to the possibility of confessing himself as the worst of sinners, which he has not gotten to, but it has opened him up to that. Now when he thinks of Jane, she is not a tool that he needs to bring to Nice, but instead she has deep wells and knee-deep meadows of happiness. The language here is paradisal. The language here is very similar to what Jane felt when she walked in the gardens. She could enjoy things for their own sake. It's this vision of Jane, in the same way that the garden led Jane away from her false vision of the world. Now in prison, Mark is led away from his false vision of the world by Jane herself. When he is led by Frost into the objectivity room, he is being made to no longer believe in the objective goods. This goes back to the abolition of man. He is trying to be immunized to the idea that there are any objective morals, any objective standards of good. If you remember in the reading when the grammar textbook writers were saying that it's not that a waterfall is sublime, it gives you sublime feelings. It's a false recognition of what is objective versus what is subjective. And Frost is trying to condition him away from putting any register on his subjective responses to things as having truth in them, that his subjective response could lead him towards an objective truth. But what happens is that Mark realizes what's happening in this room, and it is like the veil has been lifted. He says, as the desert teaches men to love water, or absence reveals affection. This is via negativa. There rose instead against the background of the sour and the crooked a vision of the sweet and the straight. Something vaguely called normal existed, and it was mixed up with Jane and fried eggs and soap and sunlight and the rooks cawing at Cure Hardy. What Mark realizes reminds readers of Narnia Chronicles of when the children are underground in the silver chair with Puddleglum, and even if such a thing as sunlight doesn't exist, Puddleglum says he would still choose a world or imagine a dream in which it does. He would choose that over this so-called reality that is only darkness. And this is what's happening with Mark. He's in the objective world, or a world without objectivity, in which objectivity is being removed. There is no Tao, there is no standard, there is no truth or goodness, and yet he has a memory of sunlight and fried eggs, and he wants those things more than he wants this vision that Frost is offering him. The final step in his move to a conversion, and again, he does not embrace Christianity by the end of the book, but he refuses to trample the crucifix. Frost is saying that this is the final move, and yet this is what confuses Mark the most. Why is it, he wonders, have there been so many religious pictures? Why this cross? Suddenly it takes on a new register that he had never even associated before. He didn't want to be drowning. He didn't want to be in the desert and thirsting without the idea that there exists water. Now this is taking on supernatural or religious implications that Mark didn't understand that it had. He didn't grow up in the church the way that Jane grew up in the church and then fell away from it by practice. Mark never has had this, and he doesn't understand it from a religious perspective. And yet, when he looks at this wooden crucifix, he sees himself in Christ. He empathizes with this little man in the sense that this little man is helpless, or appears to be helpless. He's wooden, he's stuck. And what he gets a sense of is this longing for straightness and normalcy and sweetness that he's begun to have seems associated with this image. This is an image of what happens when the crooked, like Bellberry, meets the straight. It's what Bellberry does to the straight. They crucify it. And in the greatest moment for Mark in the novel that really saves him so that he doesn't go down with the whole group at Nice, he says it's all bloody nonsense, which of course is true, and I'm damned if I do such a thing, and also true, more true than he knows. He is trying to just make an explicative or an exclamation, and yet he's actually speaking truth for the first time in a long time. His words mean something. Jane's conversion is more subtle. She is a churchgoer who has fallen away. She's been drawn to these things. Really, the only problems for her have been this antagonism towards hierarchy, or a fear that she will not be equal. And yet when she's hunting for Merlin, she begins to think about the Maladel in the same way that Mark begins to think about his choices and how they've led to this moment when he's confronted with death and prison and knowing that he's going to be executed and he can easily be killed by Nice. Jane begins to wonder about death and whether or not there is anything on the other side of this life. And that kind of reflection makes her feel as though she has to make a choice, which Ransom flat out tells her she does. You have to make a choice. And he calls God the adversary. If you read Surprised by Joy, this is what Lewis calls God, the adversary, the one that you were against until, like John Donne's poetry says, until the enemy ravishes you. So you will no longer be chased until the enemy ravishes you is a Donne line from Batter My Heart, Three-Person God. And here Jane is a Donne scholar realizing that her enemy is the one she has to let ravish her so that she may be chased. Unlike Mark, who is beginning to be drawn to the straight and the crooked, but not necessarily to Christ himself, Jane begins to think of a person and begins to feel a person demanding something of her and is being drawn into a relationship, not just to an idea of straight over crooked. Finally, Merlin. This is something that Tolkien hated in this book, the idea that we just have Merlin included in the middle of it, that it was very Charles Williams-ish of Lewis to do this, that he was heavily influenced by this idea of Arthur. I think it would also be a George MacDonald way of doing this, who was also drawn to the King Arthur stories. Merlin is a larger-than-life character, and he is more than medieval. He is ancient, and his ideas of modern don't fit well with him. There's no way that you could convince Merlin to join the side of nice. He's too ancient for that. He's not able to be overcome by the arguments of nice. He's connected with nature and with the mystical in a way that provides a barrier to any of the ideas that nice would try to impose on him. Many people see the intervention of Merlin as being a deus ex machina in the narrative. However, what happens in the story is that Merlin himself receives the power of the 5 gods from the 5 different planets. And 5 gods lowercase, these are the Oyarsa, the Eldils from these other planets. They are, in a sense, like angels in a way. They represent these virtues that will help Merlin overcome nice. And they have to work through people so they don't destroy people. So they are giving these gifts of their spirits, in a sense, to Merlin so that he can conquer at nice. It's a beautiful scene that I won't draw too much from, but when you walk through this chapter, The Descent of the 5 Gods, you get to see just the mere connection with these gods as they are coming towards Merlin has an effect on the rest of the household. The rest of the household begins to speak almost like a descent of the Holy Spirit, giving them the powers of various languages. They are able to mean more than they say. They're able to have several different meanings that are witty when they talk to one another. They feel in love with each other. Even McPhee thinks this is the right people to be with. This is the company I would die for. They dance, they play. It's an experience when the gods descend, that something mystical and overwhelming happens here as the supernatural meets the natural. In contrast to the descent of the gods, we have what is happening over at Bellbury. When Merlin sneaks into Bellbury and does this acting scene between him and the tramp that they think is Merlin, and he brings down hell to them. They have invited hell, and he gives it free rein in these final scenes. David Downing has compared these scenes to Dante's Inferno, and he draws many different connections between the two worlds. There's gibberish. This is the Tower of Babel. Miss Hardcastle begins shooting everyone. Her sadism comes out in full violence. The animals break in not to eat, not because they're hungry, but they become murderous accomplices of the demonic forces that are in this house and destroy. They don't play with the others the way the bear, Mr. Bultitude, plays with Mags. They kill everyone. They're bloodthirsty at this point. And so this is a horrifying scene that many people felt was uncomfortable and unnecessary, but I think it shows the infernal damage that was invited when they asked the bad Eldils to be the head of their group. However, the ending is happy. They do not end with the horror, but they end with the beauty. You have a scene that is very much like The Man Who Was Thursday. They are costumed, but the costumes reveal their true nature. There is healing and cure that takes place here. Ransom's last direction to Jane does seem, again, misogynistic. Go in obedience and you will find love. you will not have dreams, but have children. He doesn't really bless her work that she goes and bears fruit in her dissertation on done, which also would be such a great good in the world. But instead, it's only about her ability to be fertile. And so a lot of people have problems with this vision of Jane. Not that it's not a beautiful thing to be fruitful and multiply, because of course it is, and it is biblical here. But that said, it's at least beautiful that things are going to be fruitful and they're not going to unwind into nothingness. And even Mark realizes this. The very end of the narrative, he does not see Christ, he does not get a vision of God, but he gets a vision of Venus. And his move towards Jane and towards Venus is very similar to a move from, Dante moving towards Beatrice. That these things will eventually draw him to Christ, even if at the close of the narrative he has not yet been drawn to Christ.